Hey guys, tonight we're plunging into a time where parental discipline made timeout corners look like luxury spas. Imagine being a kid in the Middle Ages. You've just spilled some goat milk, talked back, or heaven forbid, fidgeted during Vespers, and suddenly you're being marched to a dark little pantry with a splintered wooden door and no way out. You won't get your stew, your feet are cold, and the rats are uncomfortably social. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are, so we can marvel at who else is falling asleep to medieval horror stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trudging barefoot across uneven stone flooring, too scared to cry too loud because Father's rules echo louder than any sobbing ever could. The pantry door creaks open, wooden, low-ceilinged, damp. It smells of onions, mold, and something you can't quite name, but it's definitely alive. Locked in the pantry. It sounds mildly inconvenient to modern ears, like no video games until Thursday. But for kids back then, this was a serious ordeal. Parents across Europe used small, dark storerooms to isolate their children for hours or even full days. It wasn't always malicious. Many believed solitude built character. A crying child came out quieter, humbler, or at least more cautious. Some pantries were literal kitchen closets, stone rooms under staircases where pickled meats and barrels of flour shared space with terrified children. Others were just wooden trunks or chests. The kid would be curled in like cargo, lid closed, sometimes with a candle snuffed just to reinforce the point. No food, no water, and if you were lucky, no mice. You press your hands against the wall, cold stone, and try to count the bricks. 1, 2, 3. Anything to not think about the skittering sound behind the sacks of dried beans. Historians still argue whether this was widespread punishment or more of a rural, peasant household affair. What's agreed on is that it wasn't illegal. There were no medieval child protection laws, no hotline to call. You misbehaved, you got creative consequences. In fact, some chroniclers praised such discipline, calling it necessary stillness for wayward spirits. The fringe cases? Well, there are 14th century writings from southern France referencing parents who would hang dried herbs over the pantry to ward off rebelliousness. The idea was that the scent of rosemary or wormwood might purify the air and the child's attitude. One Italian record even mentions a child being locked in a pantry with a goat to see which of the two brays first. And there you are, a grubby 10-year-old with scraped knees, clutching your knees to your chest, whispering apologies into the darkness, though no one's there to hear them. Not until the wooden latch rattles again. What makes this all so chilling is the everydayness of it. There wasn't always drama, no dramatic beatings, no fire and brimstone sermons, just the quiet punishment of being forgotten on purpose. Maybe you whistled during Mass. Maybe you let the chickens out again. The reason never mattered as much as the lesson. Silence, darkness, reflection. Some parents even measured the punishment by candle time. You'll stay in there until this stub burns out, which, by the way, is a fantastically terrifying way to teach time to a child. One German folk tale from the late 1200s tells of a baker's son who was locked in the bread room and told he wouldn't eat until he repented, surrounded by loaves. You can imagine the psychological tension. Do you sneak a bite and earn a beating, or starve obediently and impress your father with your restraint? Tough call when you're 9 and everything smells like rye. Still, not every pantry tale ends in trauma. Some now elderly nuns in convent memoirs wrote that such solitude made them learn prayer or taught them to listen more. They saw it as a blessing, though let's be honest, you can convince yourself of anything after 50 years of vows and a diet of lentils. But let's zoom back out. Imagine today someone locking a kid in a dark closet for swiping a sweet roll. The outrage would hit the local paper before the roll hit the ground. And yet, in many medieval homes, this was seen not only as acceptable, but necessary. A child left to think in the dark came out, they believed, more godly. You squirm on the floor. The pantry is silent now, but your mind isn't. You remember the village priest's sermon, "Idleness is the devil's cradle." You were idle, so now you're in your cradle. It's not metaphorical, and you think maybe, just maybe, next time you'll wipe your feet before entering the chapel. Outside, life goes on. The adults sip broth. Siblings gossip. No one rushes to rescue you, because being rescued would mean the punishment worked too quickly. And medieval punishments weren't meant to be quick. They were meant to echo. Maybe that's why you'll remember the smell of onions and mildew for the rest of your life. Not because it was horrible, though it was, but because it was quiet. Terrifyingly quiet. And that, in the Middle Ages, might have been the point all along. You're finally out of the pantry. Your legs are pins and needles, your pride's in pieces, and your eyes squint against the brightness of the hearth fire. But before your feet can even warm up, you're dragged by the wrist toward the front gate. Not again. This time it's the shame corner. And no, you won't be alone. You're plopped down on a wobbly wooden stool at the crossroads of village foot traffic, maybe with a sign hung around your neck, liar or disobedient, for every neighbor, cousin, and toothless goat herder to see. If you're lucky, that's all you're wearing. If not, you're also sporting one of the most iconic medieval accessories, the dunce cap. Now, it's worth noting that the pointy hat wasn't invented by fairy tale villains. It was a real thing. Originating in the late 13th century, the dunce cap was inspired by the controversial educational theories of John Duns Scotus, whose followers believed the cone shape funneled knowledge into the head. Ironically, after Duns fell out of favor, his name and hat were used mockingly. So, instead of learning, You're now on display, a human scarecrow of shame and social correction. Villagers walk by and chuckle, toss a cabbage leaf or two, or just shake their heads in pity. It's not violent, but it burns deep. Your face flushes, your eyes water, but you don't dare cry. That would just make them laugh harder. And yes, kids weren't the only ones subjected to public shaming. Adults got the stocks, the pillory, the cucking stool, but children, they got smaller, more localized humiliations, a stool on the steps, a placard on their back. Sometimes even a bell hung around the neck to warn people, this one lies. Imagine being 8 and having to stand on a barrel during the Sunday market because you told your brother there were fish in the well. Spoiler, there were no fish. But now there's a new nickname following you for life, Fishwell Frederick. Historians still argue whether this was more common in towns or rural parishes. Towns had tighter spaces, more public eyes, and more incentive to correct children quickly and communally. Villages, while more isolated, often leaned into rituals of ridicule passed down through generations. Either way, the goal was the same: humiliate the misbehavior out of you. But here's a curious fringe case. In some parts of medieval Sweden, they used painted masks, ugly, grotesque faces carved from wood or molded from leather, strapped to a child's head while they stood in silence. The idea? Make the child see the ugliness of their sin reflected physically. If that's not an early form of psychological horror, I don't know what is. Now back to you. You shift uncomfortably on the splintered stool. Your knees ache. Your cap is too tight, and there's a goose staring at you. You try not to blink. The goose wins. A passerby gives you a pity apple. Another smirks and says, "Should have listened to your mom, eh?" You think, yeah, probably. But it's hard to concentrate when a fly keeps landing on your forehead and your hat won't let you swat it away. The shame corner wasn't always a solitary experience. Some towns practiced group humiliation. 3 or 4 kids lined up for collective guilt. Say you and your friends decided to skip catechism and go watch the blacksmith shoe a mule. The priest finds out? Congratulations. You're all seated shoulder to shoulder, forced to chant psalms in unison while the town glares. But sometimes the worst part wasn't what they did to you. It was what they said around you. Parents would say things loud enough to be heard. He's always been slow, or maybe a few more days like this will fix that tongue. Words that sting longer than any birch switch. You start counting chickens to distract yourself. You're up to 23 when you hear your name, real name this time, not the mocking nickname. Your mother's come to fetch you. She doesn't smile, just nods, which is both a relief and somehow worse than a scolding. There's this strange pride in surviving the shame corner. Some older kids sneer at newcomers like battle veterans. You only got the cap? Pfft, I had to wear the bell and sing. And somewhere deep in your shrinking childhood heart, you whisper, I never want to be here again. Interestingly, Some monastic schools kept detailed shame logs, literal ledgers listing infractions, dates, and how long each child had to stand in punishment. These weren't just moral records. They were tools for tracking a child's spiritual progress. You lied 3 times this month. That's 3 steps closer to being a sinner. Better stand up straighter. And here's the kicker. Medieval parents truly believed that shame, not pain, shaped better behavior. Because shame lingered. You could forget a bruise, but humiliation, that tattooed itself on your soul like soot in a chimney. So you trudge back to your cottage, wool cap in hand, cheeks still hot. Your siblings stare. Your father snorts. No one claps. No one says you did your time. Because in the Middle Ages, punishment wasn't about balance. It was about reminder. And tomorrow, if you're caught sneaking honey or skipping chores, that stool might just be waiting for you again, this time with a sign that reads, "Back so soon? You're quieter today." Not from wisdom exactly, more like tactical retreat. But still, there's something eerie about walking on eggshells while monks whisper Latin and your parents won't even look at you. Welcome to the silent treatment, cloister style. If you thought the modern cold shoulder was bad, wait until you experience the full medieval upgrade, an actual vow of silence, forcibly imposed, sometimes lasting days, weeks, even months. You shuffle into the hall and sit on a hard bench while your older sister finishes grinding barley. You open your mouth to ask for some, but your mother's eyes freeze you in place. Not with rage, no, that would be easy. It's the silence that kills. She's still angry from yesterday's tantrum. You're now in what can only be described as emotional exile. Now, silence as punishment wasn't limited to households. In monasteries and religious schools, silence was a full-blown institution. Monastic orders like the Benedictines and Cistercians believed that speech led to sin, gossip, pride, deception. So they didn't just encourage silence, they mandated it. Some novices weren't allowed to speak for 2 years, except during confession or prayer. And if you were a child caught talking out of turn in these environments, welcome to the disciplinary vow. You're told, often in front of the group, that you may not speak until you are deemed pure of tongue again. And no, there's no clear timeline, just a lot of nodding, awkward hand gestures, and uncomfortable meals eaten in silence while everyone else avoids eye contact. But even outside the cloister, silence was weaponized. Parents used it not only to punish misbehavior, but to create an emotional minefield. You said something rude? No one responds. You try to explain yourself? More silence. You cry? Silence with a side of disapproving glares. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious disciplinary strategy or just good old-fashioned medieval moodiness. Some claim it came from a belief that a silent home breeds a thoughtful child. Others think it was simply easier than yelling. After all, in households with 12 kids, discipline by volume control has its perks. Fringe tidbit incoming. In a few 14th century Carmelite records, children undergoing long silences were given penitential chalkboards to wear around their necks. Yep, tiny slates on strings. If they had to communicate something vital, like needing the privy or announcing someone caught fire, they could write it. But even that was discouraged unless the matter pertained to mortal safety. You know, minor stuff. So imagine you're 7, starving, and trying to scratch the word bread onto a little board while your older brother smirks because he's already on his second bowl of turnip stew. Meanwhile, some parents would go even further, placing signs over the hearth or front door, reading "Silent Child Within" to remind visitors and siblings not to speak to the punished child. You become invisible. Your thoughts echo back louder than your own voice would have. You start to notice the sounds you didn't before: wood creaking, soup bubbling, chickens fighting somewhere outside. Every rustle feels enormous. Every dropped spoon is a cannon blast. You retreat inward, wondering how long this is supposed to last. And then there's the strange part. Some kids embraced it. There are scattered accounts in old convent memoirs where girls, mostly girls notably, found the silence comforting, even holy. One wrote, "I sinned with my voice, and now I hear God clearer." Another simply said, "Silence is quieter than scolding." But don't be fooled. The silence didn't mean peace. It was a pressure cooker. Because when no one speaks to you, every gesture becomes a test. Every sigh from father is a verdict. Every eyebrow twitch from mother is a sermon. And you become fluent in a new language, guilt-glare dialect. Now, let's be clear. Modern psychologists would have a field day with this. Emotional withdrawal as a control mechanism? Classic red flag. But medieval parents didn't have parenting books. They had proverbs, Latin sermons, and a lot of belief in the cleansing power of discomfort. So you keep your head down. You don't speak during chores. You don't speak during prayer. You don't even sing when the neighbor girl sings while feeding the goats. And somewhere in your little soul, a quiet rebellion begins to grow. Because silence can teach obedience, but it also teaches plotting. You begin to observe more. You learn who sighs the loudest when hungry, who steals a spoonful of cream. You become the household spy without saying a word, which might explain why, in some noble households, silence was assigned as a test of loyalty. Not punishment, training. It's hard not to laugh at the irony. A culture obsessed with morality created children too scared to speak. You wonder if you'll ever get your voice back. You try whispering to the dog, but he just wags his tail and walks off. Betrayed again. Eventually, the silence ends, not with a grand speech, not even a pat on the back. You just wake up one day and someone asks, "Are you done being foolish?" And you know this is your test. Say yes, and you might eat dinner again. Say no, and it's another week of wordless exile. So you nod, carefully, quietly, and mutter the first word in days. Yes, it tastes strange, like dust and apples, but the lesson sticks. You talk less now. You listen more, not because you're wiser, but because you're scared of being erased again. And that, in the Middle Ages, was seen as a victory. You're being watched now, not with anger. No, this is more clinical. Your parents exchange nods, a silent verdict passed down between sips of broth. You've been fidgeting again. The chores were done half-heartedly. You asked too many questions at the wrong time. Maybe it's that suspicious tone you used when talking about the bishop's sermon. Whatever it was, it's enough. They bring out the rope. Tonight, you're not going to sleep in your straw pallet. Tonight, you're going to be chained to the bedpost. Now, don't imagine iron shackles and dungeon walls. This wasn't always a full-blown Gothic nightmare. Sometimes it was just a thin hemp rope knotted to your wrist, tied to the leg of the bed or a post in the corner. But other times, especially in stricter or wealthier households, parents used actual metal rings fixed to the furniture, or heavy cuffs left over from who knows what. You're led to the corner room, the one with fewer windows and more spiders. You know the drill. One arm out. Don't squirm. If you cry, they'll pull it tighter. It's not about bruises. It's about staying put. The idea here was simple. Children who couldn't behave while free had to learn how to behave while restrained. It was seen as a lesson in stillness, in patience, in humility. Because a child who can't sit still, they believed, can't sit for prayer, and a child who can't sit for prayer can't be saved. Your wrist itches almost instantly, not because the rope is rough, though it is, but because your mind is already fighting it. You reach for your blanket. Can't. You try to scratch your neck. Can't. You try to roll over. Nope. Welcome to medieval sleep therapy. Historians still argue whether this form of restraint was used more commonly on boys or girls. Some say boys were bound more often due to their natural unruliness, while others argue girls were subjected to it quietly to teach modesty. Either way, it was rarely documented explicitly. It was private discipline, whispered about, passed from parent to parent like a well-worn recipe for obedience. But in some places, it was official. In 15th century Florence, a set of domestic correction manuals written for wealthier households outlined proper restraint methods, including using a smooth leather strap to limit motion without bruising. Yes, they had best practices for tying down children. A weird flex, Florence. And here's a creepy little fringe tidbit. In certain noble houses, there were disciplinary beds with built-in loops and rings. They looked almost identical to normal beds, but they allowed for a variety of restraint positions: left side, right side, both arms, even ankles. The goal was total stillness. They called it the sleep of saints. Back in your corner, time starts to bend. You hear the crackle of the hearth, someone laughing in another room, a dog snoring. You can't tell if it's midnight or dawn. All you know is that your back aches and your fingers are cold. Eventually, the restraint starts to feel like a presence, not just rope or chain, but a spirit hovering by your side, whispering that you deserve this, that you brought it on yourself, that maybe if you hadn't spoken during grace or dropped that jug, you'd be tucked under your blanket like everyone else. You'd try to fall asleep. You'd try to ignore the numbness in your hand. You'd try to believe this is temporary. Sometimes it was a few hours. One night, long enough to scare you, short enough not to leave marks. But other times, it stretched longer. There are rare accounts, almost folklore, of children left tied overnight for multiple days, fed where they sat, made to sleep in their own filth as a lesson in humility. We can't confirm all of them, but the stories existed, and where stories exist, there's usually a kernel of cruel truth. Interestingly, there was a strange theology behind it, too. Some religious teachers argued that restraint symbolized divine submission. That being bound, if endured patiently, made one closer to God. That's right. Your bedtime punishment could also be marketed as a spiritual retreat. In extreme cases, kids weren't tied to furniture. They were tied to themselves. A belt around both wrists, or a rope binding the ankles together so they couldn't run, wander, or even stretch. It wasn't just about containment, it was about control. Now you might be thinking, why not just escape? Undo the knot? Wriggle free? Sure. And if you're caught, guess what? Next time, it's both arms, or no dinner, or the pantry and the rope. It escalates quickly. You finally drift off at some point, dreams sticky and strange, filled with faceless figures and never-ending corridors. You wake up with a sore shoulder and damp eyes. No one asks if you slept well. In the morning, they untie you without ceremony. No hug, no lesson, just a nod and a bowl of watered-down porridge. You're free, but you're also not, because now you know freedom is conditional. And here's the kicker. This method didn't always breed fear. Sometimes it bred resentment. Quiet kids became cold kids, and cold kids learned how to stay silent, follow rules, and hide everything else. Emotion became a liability. Disobedience was too risky. You don't want to be the one chained again. So you nod when asked a question. You smile when told to scrub the floors. And if someone spills something, you don't say a word. Because in the back of your mind, the itch of that rope never fully goes away. It hums under your skin. A bedtime lullaby, Middle Ages edition. The air bites tonight. It's not just cold, it's sharp, like someone left the wind out with a knife. Your boots are nowhere to be found, which feels intentional. Your coat still damp from yesterday. But that doesn't matter, not to your father. He's already pointing toward the door. You're going out there barefoot. This is punishment by cold, and it's no exaggeration to say it was one of the most casually cruel methods parents used during the Middle Ages. Why beat a child when nature could do it for you? You step outside, feet instantly recoiling from the packed dirt, frosty, rough, littered with pebbles that might as well be tiny daggers. The cold climbs up your ankles, your legs, right into your chest like a creeping fog. You gasp, but no one opens the door behind you. You're supposed to learn something. Historically speaking, the Middle Ages had no shortage of chilling punishments. Literally. Cold was seen not only as uncomfortable but purifying. It cleansed disobedience the way icy rivers were believed to wash away sin. In the minds of many, particularly in the north of Europe, enduring cold built moral strength. Parents often sent misbehaving children outside for hours at a time, not far, just far enough to lose the house's warmth. Some were ordered to kneel in snowbanks. Others had to walk laps around the cottage barefoot or dip their hands into cold water and hold them there until they stopped trembling with lies. You'd trudge across the frozen yard, breath fogging in the air, wondering how many more steps it'll take before you stop feeling your toes. The goats stare at you like you're insane. Even they get hay. Historians still argue whether these punishments were standardized or improvised. No law book from the 1300s lists barefoot in the frost as an official disciplinary tactic. But chroniclers in German monasteries wrote about corrective exposure, and several family letters from the Low Countries hint at parents keeping children in the stables overnight to teach gratitude. Let's not forget the ice-dunking method, rare but real. If a child was caught lying or stealing, some parents, especially near rivers, dip them waist-deep in freezing water, not long enough to kill, but long enough to scare. One record from rural England describes a boy bathed in the creek that his tongue might freeze to truth. Bit dramatic, maybe, but medieval logic rarely played fair. There's also a fringe detail from Eastern Europe. Some parents would make children sleep on stone floors during winter as penance, believing the chill would humble them. The stone was God's mattress, they'd say. You had to earn the hay. You paused near the well, teeth chattering, fingers curled into fists inside your sleeves. A distant owl hoots. You'd laugh at the irony, grounded outside, but your jaw won't move enough. Eventually, your body starts playing tricks. Your feet stop hurting, which is somehow worse than when they did. You feel floaty, like the punishment has entered its second phase, numbness. This is where the lessons really sink in. Back in the house, your parents wait. Not anxiously, purposefully. They'll let you back in soon, but not before the cold has done its job. Not before it carves that lesson into your muscles, deep enough that you'll hesitate next time you feel like skipping your chores or giving sass during grace. There's also a performative side to it. Neighbors sometimes saw these punishments and said nothing, or worse, nodded approvingly. Children in medieval society were often viewed as incomplete adults, vessels that needed to be shaped by discipline before they could be trusted with full personhood. Cold wasn't cruelty, it was correction, but not everyone agreed. In some monastic teachings, exposure to harsh weather was considered dangerous for immature souls, especially younger children. Compassionate abbots warned against frostbite punishments, citing divine mercy. So yes, even back then, the parenting debate was in full swing. One quirky case? A 14th century Irish text mentions a mother making her son wear snow-filled shoes during prayer as a punishment for profanity. Cold and penance all at once. The note adds, "He wept not for God, but for toes." Eventually, your door creaks open. A hand gestures you back inside, and you bolt in like a hunted rabbit. The warmth hits you like fire, too hot after too long outside. Your skin tingles, pins and needles dancing up your legs as blood returns. Your father doesn't say anything, neither does your mother. You stand there, soaking wet and shaking, waiting for judgment. There isn't any, just the quiet clinking of bowls being filled. Your brother slides a chunk of bread your way. It's cold too. Maybe that's the strangest part of it all. These punishments rarely came with speeches, no lectures, no cozy post-lesson chats, just the cold. And then not the cold, which somehow felt even more manipulative. You wrap a blanket around yourself and sit by the fire. It takes ages to stop shaking, and in your bones that chill lingers, not just the physical cold, but the memory of it, the kind of lesson that rises up years later when you feel snow on your fingers and wonder why it makes your stomach hurt. The punishment didn't leave scars. It didn't need to. It just needed to remind you that warmth, like trust, could be taken away. It starts with a tunic. Looks ordinary enough. Dull wool, scratchy collar. Same color as boiled oats, but something's off. It's heavier than usual. Much heavier. You try lifting it. Nope, that's not just cloth. Your mother nods sternly. Put it on. You obey. And just like that, you've entered the world of weighted discipline cloaks, a punishment that literally burdened children with the weight of their behavior. Once the tunic slips over your shoulders, you stagger. It's been sewn with small stones or sometimes iron pieces stitched into hidden interior pockets. Some versions used chains at the hem to restrict walking. Others had coarse sand packed into sleeves, so lifting your arms became an ordeal. This wasn't a game. In certain households, especially religious or noble ones, these cloaks were kept specifically for discipline. The logic? If your soul was heavy with sin, your body should feel it too. You try walking across the room, and every step feels like you're dragging a pile of wet bread. The cloak pulls on your neck, swings awkwardly at your hips. The movement's not painful exactly, but exhausting. The symbolism is clear. Bad behavior is a burden, and you're now wearing yours for all to see. Historians still argue whether these garments were standardized punishments or more of a theatrical teaching tool used by strict abbeys and overzealous parents. But they're referenced in more than one medieval penitential text. One manuscript from 14th century Saxony outlines the use of heavy vestments to press down childish pride. In other words, kids were being flattened emotionally and physically. One fringe case from Hungary describes a version of this cloak made with baking stones, flat, warm, when first inserted, but slowly cooling to a clammy, uncomfortable weight. The document adds that the child was required to recite Psalm 38 while wearing it, as a reminder that iniquities are a weight too great to bear. Back in your shoes, or lack of them, you're now doing chores in this thing. Sweeping, difficult, gathering kindling, practically a comedy. You lean too far, and the whole cloak pulls you down like a sleepy bear, hugging your spine. You catch your reflection in a basin of water. You don't look like yourself. You look lower, somehow, reduced. And in a way, that's the point. Parents often made their children wear these cloaks during peak activity hours, chores, family gatherings, even prayer time. The weight wasn't just physical, it was performative. Everyone could see that you'd messed up. You were now the slow one, the heavy soul, the lesson in real time. Your siblings snicker behind their hands. Even the dog seems mildly concerned. In some places, particularly near the Alps, similar garments were referred to as burden robes or guilt jackets. Local superstition held that the weight helped press out the devil's mischief through the skin. Sounds gross, right? But remember, these were the same folks rubbing garlic on babies to ward off curses. Medieval parenting wasn't exactly subtle. Now comes the worst part. You're not allowed to remove it until they say so. And not just they. Sometimes it's up to a priest or a family council, depending on how dramatic your parents are feeling. You sit, you wait, you sweat, and you think. That's what they wanted. Time to think, to stew in your wrongness, and to feel it literally weighing you down, so that next time your impulse flares up, whether to lie, sass, or sneak honey from the jar, you'll remember how this cloak made your knees ache. Interestingly, there's a monastic debate recorded in 1321 where a group of friars discuss whether using weighted garments was a form of sin purification or psychological cruelty. One side argued it helped children connect with the gravity of moral failure. The other worried it invited despair and sluggishness in youth. So, yes, medieval therapists sort of existed. You try sitting down. Bad idea. The stones shift weirdly, pressing into your ribs. You stand again, but now your shoulders are cramping. The cloak turns your whole body into a guilt machine, and when the time finally comes to take it off, your mother doesn't smile. She just unties the belt, lets the cloak drop with a heavy thump, and nods once. It's over. But the relief is not immediate. Your back hurts, your arms ache, and your emotions are mushy. A weird cocktail of shame, exhaustion, and the awkward realization that, well, it worked. You'll think twice before misbehaving again, not because you fear punishment, but because that cloak made your very existence feel like effort. You shuffle to your room, light as a feather now, but your body still leans forward, out of habit. You feel phantom weight on your shoulders, like the stones are still there, whispering moral advice. Don't talk back. Don't forget the eggs. Don't blink too loud. And here's the thing. This wasn't meant to scar you. Not directly. The weight was never meant to hurt, only to remind, to simulate a kind of burdened conscience made flesh, like wrapping guilt in a blanket and throwing it on a kid's spine, which, when you think about it, might be more disturbing than a simple smack. At least that would be over quickly. This lingers, in posture, in memory, in that faint groan your bones make every time you remember the worst day you ever wore a coat. You've survived the pantry. You've been silenced, frozen, and nearly folded in half by a stone-stuffed tunic. But tonight, there's no heavy cloak waiting for you, no dark closet, no rope, just a switch, thin, flexible, freshly cut. Because tonight, you're about to experience the most familiar punishment of the medieval world, the flogging ritual. Let's clear something up early. Medieval flogging wasn't always impulsive. In fact, it was sometimes disturbingly ceremonial. Your father, or, in strict homes, a tutor, or even a priest, would take the time to choose just the right branch, or reed. Not too brittle, not too soft. Birch, willow, or hazel were popular picks. Hazel, in particular, was praised for its purity and even sting. Like wine, apparently, everyone had a favorite vintage. The switch is tested with a few whooshes through the air. You flinch instinctively, and already the lesson begins. You're ordered to kneel, maybe on bare flagstones, maybe in front of an icon or crucifix, because this isn't just discipline, it's supposed to be a spiritual reset. You're reminded of your sin. Sometimes it's something specific, a lie, a stolen piece of cheese, laughter during Mass. Other times it's general, laziness, disrespect, the vague accusation of thinking too much of yourself. Then the lashes begin. Not wild, not chaotic. That would be too merciful. No, these are counted, deliberate strikes. 3, 7, sometimes 12, one for each apostle, minus Judas, if your father's feeling generous. Each one lands with a sharp snap, followed by silence. No one rushes. You're supposed to reflect. One common belief held that each stripe chased away a devil clinging to the child's soul. That idea appears in dozens of parish sermons and family letters, especially in Catholic areas, where purification through pain was a recurring theme. It was the medieval version of "this hurts me more than it hurts you." Historians still argue whether these beatings were mostly symbolic or often brutal. Some argue that a good number of them were little more than light scoldings with a twig, especially among wealthier or more educated families who favored moral tone over bruises. Others point to coroner reports of children with visible scarring, claiming the line between ritual and abuse was often blurred or erased altogether. And the quirkier side? One 13th century manual from France suggested tying holy ribbons to the switch, believing the blows would carry divine wisdom into the body through contact with the skin. Basically, your punishment came accessorized. Back in your little kneeling space, your cheeks are hot, your breath shallow. You're not sure whether to cry or hold it in. Either might get you another round. And then, almost anticlimactically, it ends. The switch is set down. You're told to pray, or reflect, or scrub something. There's no hug. That's not the point. You walk away with thin welts on your arms or back, or thighs if modesty was a concern. In many households, clothing was never removed during these punishments. It wasn't about shame or nudity. It was about obedience, plain and simple. The body was just the paper. Your soul was what they were trying to rewrite. And what's truly eerie is how often flogging was institutionalized. It wasn't just a home practice. In schools, particularly church-run ones, flogging was a scheduled event. In some English grammar schools, flogging Fridays were a real thing. Weekly whippings for all students, regardless of misbehavior, to preserve virtue. You didn't have to do something wrong, you just had to be a child. But there's nuance, too. Some monastic educators actually debated the effectiveness of flogging. The famous 12th century scholar Peter Abelard, yes, the one who had a tragic love affair, wrote critically about corporal punishment, arguing that it bred resentment more than repentance. Other scholars disagreed, claiming it was the only language children understood. Of course, your 8-year-old self isn't thinking about theological ethics. You're just wondering why the room suddenly feels so quiet, why your legs won't stop shaking, why your siblings won't look you in the eye. One story from the Netherlands tells of a boy who was flogged before bed every night for practicing wicked dreams. A priest convinced the parents that a child's nighttime imagination could open doors to Satan. The solution? Prevent sleep with pain, just in case. And yet, some children grew up thanking their parents for it. Or so they claimed. In letters written decades later, some confess they believed the punishments saved them from pride or sin. Others, however, describe them in words that bled. You shuffle off to your little cot. No one follows. The sting lingers, warm, rhythmic, like a drumbeat of regret. You lie on your side, not from comfort, but necessity. The fire in the hearth crackles. Outside, a dog barks. Inside, your thoughts go numb. You promise yourself you'll behave better tomorrow. Whether out of guilt, fear, or just sheer fatigue, you're not even sure, and that, in the Middle Ages, was usually enough. Morning comes, and with it, another lesson. Today's punishment is not pain, not cold, not silence. It's something worse in its own way, because it never ends. Today, you're not allowed to sit down, not for meals, not during prayers, not during chores, not until nightfall, and even then, only if you've earned your rest. This is enforced standing, and it's as simple and devastating as it sounds. You think it sounds easy at first. You're just standing. How bad can it be? But then your legs begin to ache, your heels burn, your knees throb from yesterday's switchings, and you realize that this is a punishment designed to drain, not damage. Enforced standing wasn't some obscure monastic technique. It was surprisingly common. Parents, teachers, and abbots across medieval Europe used it to discipline children who were idle, defiant, or simply too fond of sitting like lords. In a world where stillness equaled virtue, standing became both punishment and proof of repentance. You try to lean, they see it. You're snapped back upright. No wall support, no shifting weight, just straight, unmoving posture, ideally with hands behind your back or flat at your sides, depending on local custom. And there were customs. In German-speaking regions, children stood facing a painted crucifix. In parts of Italy, they were made to stand atop a flat stone circle called the Wheel of Thought. It didn't turn, but the name was ominous enough to do the work. Some towns even used public standing poles, thin wooden rods placed in schoolyards or village squares where a misbehaving child would be tied upright for hours, like a scarecrow in wool socks. You blink into the sunlight. People walk past. No one really looks at you. That might be the worst part. You've stopped being visible. Now, you're furniture. Historians still argue whether this punishment originated from Roman military drills, where standing at attention was used to instill discipline, or from monastic endurance rites. But by the 13th century, it had trickled into parenting culture like spilled ink, staining homes across the continent. In stricter homes, there were rules: move, and the timer resets. Flinch, and you get extra time. In one rare surviving child discipline ledger from Normandy, parents recorded the exact minutes each child had to stand, tracking it like penance coins dropped into a church box. One quirky account from Wales tells of children who were made to hold vegetables, a turnip, a cabbage, once even a piglet, while standing to represent the burden of unripened virtue. That's a poetic way to say stand still and hold the shame carrot. You reach the first hour. Your back's cramping, your stomach growls, but no food until you've earned it. You are, after all, being taught the value of labor, of humility, of stillness. In monasteries, enforced standing could last days. Monks in training stood through entire vigils, prayers, and fasts. And in a few extreme sects, children were believed to absorb grace through suffering. So the longer you stood, the more heavenly favor you might collect. Back home, your mother sews quietly. Your siblings play near the hearth. You try not to watch them. You try not to cry. Crying leads to sniffling, and sniffling is movement. Sometimes standing was paired with silence, just for that extra layer of emotional stew. You were not to speak, fidget, or complain, and if you fell asleep on your feet, that was its own sin. You must watch and wait, like a little medieval guard dog, minus the barking, You stare at a fly crawling on the wall. It looks smug, and it's not just home life. Medieval schools were no better. One 15th century English classroom manual advised teachers to keep the slothful upright, meaning students who doodled, slouched, or, God forbid, daydreamed were made to stand until their souls resumed proper posture. One documented case from Krakow describes a girl who stood for 12 hours after being caught humming during scripture reading. They made her face a statue of the Virgin and consider her foolish mouth. That statue probably heard more mental curses than prayers. But here's the psychological twist. Standing becomes a mind trap. You start questioning everything. Am I breathing too loud? Am I swaying? Is that a twitch? Did they see that? Your own body becomes your enemy just for doing what bodies do, and no one comforts you, because that's part of it. Enforced standing was often designed to strip away sympathy. No hugs, no smiles. You're meant to feel forgotten, because then, when you're finally allowed to sit, finally told, you may kneel and pray now, you won't take comfort for granted again. You count breaths. You count tiles. You start naming cracks in the floor. One looks like a rabbit, the other like your future. Time warps. Eventually, the sun moves, casting long streaks across the room. A sibling walks over to ask a question and gets waved away. You hear the scrape of a bowl. Someone's eating. The smell of broth floods your nose. You try not to inhale too deeply, and then, at last, a voice says, "Enough." You collapse like a sack of grain, legs quivering, head spinning, muscles confused whether to ache or rejoice. You are handed a small crust of bread. That's your reward. You chew like a survivor. And here's the kicker. It worked. Not in a loving way, not in a healing way, but in a don't touch the stove again way. The next time someone even hints that you might need to stand again, you straighten your tunic, tidy your tools, and sit down only when told. You don't make the fly angry. You don't daydream about fish. You become efficient, careful, still. And so, medieval discipline claims another little victory, not with fire or fists, but with a very quiet, very long afternoon on your feet. The door creaks open, and the smell hits first. Not bad, not moldy, just weird, musty, like books and dust and something else. Maybe cabbage? You're being sent to the isolation chair, which sounds almost cozy until you realize it's been placed outside the family circle. Not in your room, not in the pantry. No, this chair is part of a broader punishment that's equal parts exile, symbolism, and plain medieval awkwardness. It's perched in the corner of the house. Or sometimes, if your parents are really feeling theatrical, it's set outside under the eaves or near the woodpile. Wherever it lands, the idea is simple. You sit in silence, facing away, for as long as it takes to reclaim your sense. This isn't quite the same as being sent to the pantry. That was darkness and sensory deprivation. This is stillness in the open, while life goes on around you. Everyone sees you. Everyone ignores you. This, dear listener, is medieval social shunning, miniaturized into chair form. You're allowed to hear the fire crackling, the dinner being ladled, the soft sounds of conversation. But you're not in it. You're just nearby, present, but excluded. It feels worse than yelling. It's worse than standing. It's being invisible on purpose. And here's the kicker. This punishment wasn't always done at home. In some towns and church-run schools, misbehaving children were made to sit in a specially designated penitent seat in public areas, outside chapels, along cloister walls, even at the edge of the market. The chair was high-backed, hard, and often carved with phrases like "silence cleanses" or "sit until worthy." Sometimes they even added a hat. That's right, the original medieval dunce cap wasn't pointy. It was just embarrassing. One version from Bohemia was a wide straw ring, like a thatched roof for your skull. If the chair was symbolic, the hat screamed it out loud. Historians still argue whether this practice influenced later Protestant shaming stools in early America. The Quakers and Puritans were big fans of making people sit and think about their sins in front of everyone. But the Middle Ages beat them to it, with much less irony and way more goats. Now, a fringe tidbit for you. In some Benedictine monasteries, naughty novices were forced to sit on a three-legged stool in front of the refectory, one leg shorter than the rest. Yes, it wobbled. That was the point. Stability, they believed, should be earned. Back in your chair, your legs start to ache within minutes. You want to stretch, but that's not allowed. You're not even sure how long this will last. Could be an hour. Could be until someone forgets you're there. The silence is crushing. Unlike the full vow of silence where you were forbidden to speak, this is the social kind. No one speaks to you, but they talk around you. The worst thing is hearing your name come up in conversation and watching the room shift when they realize you're right there. But you're not really there. You're in the chair, and the longer you sit, the more symbolic it becomes. You're not being punished for breaking a bowl. You're being taught that harmony matters more than pride, that the group, the family, the flock is sacred, and you've stepped outside the circle. This is your penance. Some households took it further. Children were required to repeat a phrase aloud every few minutes. I will sit until I have sense. I am not greater than peace. Imagine saying that 30 times with your little feet dangling off a stool. You start to internalize it. Maybe you were too loud. Maybe you did roll your eyes during prayer. Maybe this really is what you deserve. That's the sharp edge of isolation. It doesn't have to hurt your body to burrow deep. It makes you do the work for them. The more you sit, the more you wonder if something inside you really is broken. In wealthier homes, they even had decorated chairs for this purpose. Ornate punishment thrones, complete with carved faces on the arms or inscriptions like "the fool's seat." Discipline, but with upholstery. In rural communities, though, the chair was usually a stool, wooden, unbalanced, and dragged out of storage for these specific moments. like a family relic passed down through generations of grumpy children. And the truly bizarre, in some parts of early medieval Spain, children were made to sit in animal pens, still on stools, but with livestock roaming nearby. The logic? Let the beast learn from the beasts. Bit much, but memorable. You stare at a crack in the wall. You count your own fingers. Someone laughs behind you, and you flinch, unsure if it's about you or something else. Eventually, someone says, "Come back." That's all. No apology, no explanation. Just come back. And just like that, you re-enter the family. The room feels warmer. The food smells better. Your voice is allowed again, though it comes out hesitant at first. You sit with them, properly now, not on the punishment chair. And it dawns on you, the worst part wasn't the ache in your back or the numbness in your legs. It was that subtle whisper in your brain saying, "This is where you live now. This is who you are." But it passes. It always does. And that, more than anything, is what medieval punishments were built around. The long game. Not bruises, not shouts, just endurance. They weren't trying to scare you once. They were trying to shape you forever. You're awake too early. Still dark outside. The coals in the hearth haven't been stirred. No clatter of pots. No scent of oats or onions. Just the sound of feet. Yours. Because today, your punishment begins before sunrise. You've been assigned to the Walk of Atonement. No dramatic music, no trumpets or mocking crowds, just your own little pilgrimage, barefoot, silent, and directionless. You slip out the door, the cold biting instantly at your ankles. Your mother didn't say much, just pointed to the fields and told you to go walk until you remember what matters. This was the medieval version of grounding, walking as reflection. It wasn't about distance. It was about mindset. You weren't fleeing, you were returning to sense. In many regions, this was known informally as the road of humility. And you weren't the only one. Across medieval Europe, children, and sometimes even adults, were made to walk long paths after disobedience. These routes were usually local, a loop around the farm or the perimeter of a small village. But in religious communities, it could mean walking to a chapel, a holy tree, or a designated stone of repentance. Each step was symbolic. You were carrying your error away from the house and hopefully leaving it behind somewhere between the cow pasture and the hedgerow. Your feet crunch over frozen grass. A crow cackles nearby. Everything feels louder when you're not allowed to speak. Historians still argue whether these punishment walks had spiritual origins or simply practical roots. Some point to early Christian penitent pilgrimages, voluntary walks to atone for sin, as the inspiration. Others claim it came from earlier pagan rituals where motion was believed to shake off evil. Either way, by the 1200s, walking to atone had become a quiet part of family discipline. And sometimes it wasn't quiet. In certain monastic schools, children who misbehaved were sent on assigned walking routes, complete with chants or prayers to repeat aloud as they went. I have been proud. I must remember the soil. That one comes from a Benedictine rule book, written by someone who clearly never walked through nettles. You stumble a bit, mud or maybe a rabbit hole. Your hands shoot out for balance and you nearly curse. But that, of course, would add another lap. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In 14th century Bavaria, some families made children carry a small rock as they walked. The heavier the sin, the heavier the stone. The child had to find a place to bury it, symbolically laying the guilt to rest. A few places even had communal sin pits, where these rocks were tossed and forgotten. It's surprisingly poetic. Also, probably a decent workout. But back to you, because this isn't just a nature stroll. You're being watched. Maybe not by people, but by the landscape, the sky, the sense that the house behind you remembers everything you've done. The point of this punishment is subtle. You reflect, or else you repeat. Because if you come home unchanged, the walk resumes tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Some versions had specific rules. Walk at a slow pace, no shortcuts, no talking to animals. Yes, that was a real one. In 15th century Flanders, a disciplinary handbook instructed that the child must not coo at chickens or murmur at cats, lest the soul make mischief with lesser beasts. We'll let that one speak for itself. Eventually, your legs begin to ache, not like a flogging, not like standing. This is the slow fatigue of repetitive repentance. You've walked past the same tree 3 times. You're not sure if it looks smug or sympathetic. And maybe that's the weirdest part. The punishment becomes meditative. Your mind starts replaying what got you here. The sarcastic remark, the missing firewood, the refusal to say grace. You start asking yourself, was it worth it? You reach a fence. No one told you how far to go. There's no signpost, no bell, no halo that appears when your soul is fixed. So you stand, breathe, look at the horizon. This is where some kids in medieval stories would make a little pile of twigs or scratch a cross into the dirt. A sign of change, a mark that says, I was here and now I am not what I was. You consider it, then you turn back. Your legs are trembling now, not from punishment, but from effort, from thinking, from knowing that when you return to that house, you will still be watched, but maybe not sent out again. Or maybe you will, because some days it took several walks to make the lesson stick, and some children, quiet, clever ones, use the time to reflect for real, not just on what they'd done, but on who they were growing into. The walk of atonement, at its core, was about distance. Not just between you and home, but between you and the person you used to be. You pass a sheep. It stares at you like it knows everything. Rude. You reach the door. You pause. Breathe again. Inside, your mother glances up. She nods. You nod back. Nothing else is said, because that's how these punishments ended, not with apologies, not with affection, just a silent understanding. The walk is over, for now, and somehow you're tired in a way that sleep won't fix, but you are changed. A little, just enough that you won't forget that field, that crow, that fence, or that every step you took today wasn't about escaping punishment. It was about walking back to yourself. You've made it back. You've walked your guilt around the property line, and now you're home. But just because your feet are inside doesn't mean you're free, because tonight you sleep on the punishment mat. It sounds almost cozy, doesn't it? Like something you'd roll out for yoga or a polite timeout. But this mat isn't padded, it isn't clean, and it definitely doesn't come with any bedtime stories. You're ordered to unroll it in the coldest part of the floor, usually stone or packed dirt, if your family can't afford fancy things like floors. You won't be sleeping in the straw mattress with your siblings tonight. No, this thin, scratchy mat, usually woven from coarse reeds or rough wool, is your new best friend. It's called sleep deprivation by discomfort, and in the Middle Ages, it was one of the more quietly miserable punishments. This wasn't about bruises. This was about denying comfort, denying belonging. And in a world where daily life already meant aches, hunger, and exhaustion, taking away the one soft moment of the day, that hit hard. Your body immediately knows the difference. The mat doesn't yield. It itches in weird places. There's a breeze down by the hearth that you've never noticed before, and now it seems to target just you. You curl up like a salted slug and wait for sleep to pretend it's coming. Historians still argue whether this kind of punishment came from monastic sleep fasting, where monks trained themselves to rest only briefly and only in the cold, or whether it evolved out of necessity. If a child acted out, maybe they just didn't deserve the communal hay pile. Let them learn what the floor feels like. And this wasn't exclusive to homes. Punishment mats were a fixture in some church schools and orphan houses. Sometimes they weren't even mats, just designated unresting corners where children were ordered to seek penance in stillness. That sounds poetic until you realize it meant 10 hours on a flagstone with nothing but your regrets and a mouse chewing in the wall. In France, a 14th century abbey documented the use of salted blankets, coarse cloth, dipped in brine, and dried stiff. Children had to sleep under these for disobedience. The intent? To remind the flesh of its folly. Sounds like something a villain would say in a fairy tale, but nope, that's real. You shift, every joint protests. Your elbow finds a lump in the mat that might be a stray pea or a bit of gravel, and suddenly you feel like a cursed princess. Except, of course, no one's coming to rescue you. This punishment was especially effective because there was no escape. You couldn't get out of it with tears. You couldn't fake learning your lesson and move on. The mat didn't care if you sobbed. It just waited, flat and unforgiving. There's a fringe tidbit from Denmark, where parents supposedly added cold beans to the mat, scattering them underneath so Kids would roll around all night trying to avoid them. Honestly, medieval parents really leaned into the bed should feel like a punishment concept. And yet, there was also ritual. Some families had the child roll out the mat themselves. They'd say a small penitent prayer. Some would kneel before lying down. Others would sleep facing a particular direction, usually away from the hearth, symbolizing separation from warmth, forgiveness, and home. You lie there now, curled tight, trying to avoid the coldest patch. The flicker of firelight teases your closed eyelids. You're not quite awake, not quite asleep, just there. Which, of course, was the point. This punishment didn't come with visible bruises. Instead, it whispered to your subconscious, "Remember this discomfort. Don't earn it again." Some historians claim it worked because it forced introspection. You couldn't move. You couldn't talk. You had to lie still with your own mind, and medieval childhood didn't leave many chances for that. Others argue it bordered on cruelty, especially when used repeatedly or paired with food denial. Yes, that happened too. You may have noticed that no one gave you dinner tonight. In many households, the punishment mat came with a fasting clause, a skipped meal or two, to drive the lesson deeper. After all, what good is a hard floor if your stomach is still full of soup? Monks had rules about this. Some orders forbade complete fasting for children under 12. Others allowed only bread and water. In homes, it varied wildly. If your mother was feeling merciful, you might get a crust. If not, just a long night and the memory of your siblings slurping stew nearby. You're starting to drift now, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. And even that feels like cheating. Should you feel guilty for sleeping at all? Is rest something you have to deserve? These are the questions the mat was designed to plant. A child unsure of their own right to rest becomes a child more careful, more obedient, more willing to do whatever it takes to sleep beside the fire tomorrow. And perhaps that was the cruel genius of it all, turning sleep into something conditional. Eventually, your breathing slows. You forget the cold, if only for a while. Your fingers twitch, your knees uncurl, and the ache in your spine softens into numbness. You don't dream, not really, just flashes, straw, bread, a warm hand pulling a blanket up. But you know you won't get that tonight. Tonight, the mat teaches you. Tomorrow, you'll wake up stiff, quiet, careful, and you'll remember the floor. You'll remember how it didn't care if you were sorry. Only that you didn't make the same mistake again. The rooster crows, but you're already awake. Not because you're eager, because your back hurts. The mat left its memory stitched across your spine like a map, thin lines of soreness that don't quite bruise, but don't let you forget either. You sit up slowly, each movement a small test. Will today be better or worse? The answer comes fast. Today, your punishment is public apology duty. If the walk of atonement made you disappear, this one does the opposite. Now you're front and center, words trembling in your mouth, as you prepare to deliver a confession, not just to your family, but to whoever else was affected. Neighbors, teachers, maybe even livestock, depending on the crime. Public apologies were a common punishment across much of medieval Europe, and not just for children, adults too. Anyone who broke social codes, stole a loaf, insulted the miller, gossiped about the wrong nun, might be required to stand in front of a crowd and say they were wrong. For kids, it usually started at home. You'd stand by the hearth or at the table and recite a statement like, "I misused my tongue and disturbed the peace of the house." Or, if you'd broken something, "I acted with careless hands and caused waste." These weren't just admissions, they were performances of remorse, and they had to sound genuine. If you mumbled or fidgeted or threw in a sigh, your father might say, "Again, but with feeling." And now you're crying, and now you sound real. That's the goal. In some communities, apologies had to be memorized verses, rhyming lines about obedience, peace, or humility. Picture you, 10 years old, mumbling through 4 stanzas about keeping your elbows off the table and your soul in proper posture. Historians still argue whether these recitations were meant to educate or simply humiliate. Some scholars think the idea came from confessional prayers, structured scripts that absolved sin once spoken aloud. Others believe it had roots in ancient Germanic shame culture rituals, where speaking of failure aloud made it real in the eyes of the group. And of course, there were props. A child might be required to kneel while apologizing, or hold an object related to the offense. Broke a pitcher? You hold the shards. Lied about stealing eggs? You stand there clutching an egg, raw, slippery, ready to burst at the worst moment. A fringe case from 13th century Italy tells of a boy who insulted his schoolmaster's stutter. His punishment? To publicly apologize in a long-winded, tongue-twisting poem intended to show how hard it is to speak when your words don't behave. It's clever, cruel, and very, very medieval. You stand now in front of your siblings. Your mother watches, arms folded. Your cousin giggles behind their hand. You've been told to apologize for yesterday's shouting, and for stealing a dried fig, and for hiding behind the hay cart when it was time to pray. The words scrape their way out of your throat like old bread. You stammer. You swallow. You say, "I disrupted harmony and ignored the goodness of the house." There's silence. And then someone asks, "Why?" Oh no. Sometimes the apology isn't enough. You have to explain, why did you do it? What were you thinking? And if you don't know, if you shrug, that's another sin. Pride, sloth, carelessness, so you guess. I was tired. I was foolish. I forgot my place. That usually works. But here's the twist. Sometimes these apologies weren't private. Some families, especially in towns where gossip traveled faster than the plague, would require children to apologize in public. In the square, at church, even door to door, if the offense had made enough noise. Imagine knocking on your neighbor's door and saying, "I'm sorry for calling your goat smelly," with your mother standing behind you, arms crossed like Judgment Day. One documented case in Prague involved a boy who'd thrown pebbles at a nobleman's cart. He was made to kneel at the church steps with a sign around his neck that read, "My hands acted without honor." Honestly, medieval public relations. But the purpose wasn't just shame, it was reinstatement. In a society where your reputation was everything, especially in small communities, making a public apology meant rejoining the social circle. It said, "I recognize I messed up, and I'm asking to be let back in." You finish your apology now. You don't look up. Not yet. Someone coughs. A spoon clinks. Life begins again. You're allowed to sit, allowed to eat, not praised, just allowed. And that might be the most medieval thing of all, not being celebrated for your growth, just readmitted to normalcy. Later, you hear your aunt say, "That one might have a conscience after all," which in this context is the closest thing to a compliment you're going to get. You wonder, lying on your side that night, what makes an apology real? The words, the tone, the ache in your gut when people stare at you and wait for the right combination of sorrow and performance. You're not sure, but you know you don't want to do it again, and that's enough for now. You think the worst is behind you. The mat, the walk, the chair, the apology, you've done them all. You've survived without collapsing into dramatic sobs or running off into the forest to become a barefoot hermit. But just when you think it's safe to let your shoulders drop, your name is called. Today, you're facing the burden chore. This isn't a regular household task like washing a bowl or sweeping the hearth. No, this is punishment disguised as productivity, where labor becomes the lesson and your body becomes the tool. Your task? Move the firewood, not from the pile to the hearth. That would be helpful. No, you're moving it from the wood pile behind the barn to a small square drawn in the dirt, and then back again, over and over. This is circular labor, a medieval favorite. And don't be fooled. This wasn't about getting things done. It was about breaking the rhythm of misbehavior with useless repetition. A kind of manual meditation that left your muscles sore and your pride quietly shredded. Historians still argue whether these tasks were inspired by monastic routines, where even the most revered monks chopped wood, dug holes, or peeled turnips as a way of staying humble. Others claim it has deeper roots in Roman military punishments, where soldiers were sometimes ordered to dig ditches, then fill them in again. The point? Obedience through futility. For children, it was a little more creative. You might be told to carry buckets of water from one end of the garden to the other and pour them into the ground, or scrub a plank that would later be thrown into the fire, or, this one's real, sort stones by size, with no end goal except apparently character building. You look down at your hands They already sting from yesterday's apology-induced sweat. You look up at the pile. It's bigger than you remembered. You carry the first log. It's not even that heavy. But it's awkward, and you're forbidden to carry more than one at a time. Something about learning patience. You trudge through the mud, drop it in the square, and walk back. And again, and again. The sun starts to climb, and your sleeves stick to your arms. There's no audience, no one watching to make sure you don't cheat. But you don't dare cheat, because you know someone will notice. And besides, the real punishment here isn't the wood, it's the pointlessness. One fringed tale from England tells of a girl ordered to count the corn, literally one grain at a time, because she spoke out of turn at a feast. She got through 2 handfuls before bursting into tears. Her punishment was considered a success. In some areas, this kind of labor punishment was formalized. Church schools and guild apprenticeships had entire catalogs of chore penance. Sweep the chapel floor with a rag tied to your knees. Shell peas until your fingers blister. Sort feathers for pillows you don't get to use. It's all about dissonance, doing something that resembles usefulness but isn't. The brain fights it, the body hates it, and eventually the mind gives in. That's the goal. You're on your 15th log now. You've started naming them. This one is Thaddeus. He's got a knot like your uncle's nose. You're not even sure if the square's still a square. You accidentally kick the lines out halfway through. A bee buzzes by. You resist the urge to yell at it, and yet there's something meditative here, something oddly peaceful. No yelling, no correction, just the rhythm of moving, sweating, sighing. You almost forget you're being punished until someone calls out, "Are you finished with your character yet?" Back to reality. In one monastery in Ireland, boys who broke their vows were made to dig foot-deep holes and then sit in them. When asked what they were doing, they'd reply, "Burying my pride." Not metaphorically, literally. Some dug entire rows. You finish the last log. You pause. No one says anything. And then you're told, "Now put them back." You want to scream? You don't? That's growth, right? Because the lesson here isn't really about wood or buckets or rocks. It's about doing something unpleasant, thoroughly, without complaint, and doing it again. You begin carrying the logs back. The sun's hotter now. Your knees ache. You start humming, just to keep from crumbling. This is punishment as persistence training, quiet endurance, medieval childhood's favorite gym membership. And here's the kicker. Sometimes it worked. Not because the task built muscles, but because it built memory. Next time you feel like rolling your eyes or hiding a crust of bread in the rafters, you'll remember this day, the repetition, the pointlessness, the splinters, and you'll think, maybe I'll just behave instead. That's the medieval dream, obedience through exhaustion. You place the final log back on the pile. You step away. Someone nods. No praise, no reward. just the slow return of silence. And when you sit later that night on the regular floor, not the mat, your arms throb, but your conscience is oddly quiet. Because the punishment chore might not have fixed you, but it certainly slowed you down. It's dusk again, and you're chewing your bread a little more quietly than usual. You've been good today. Not perfect, of course, but you remembered to say your prayers, didn't pick a fight over stew scraps, and even helped your sister with the laundry without being told. But the adults haven't forgotten your string of offenses from earlier in the week, and they've decided it's time for a different kind of punishment. Not one that bruises the back or tires the legs. No, this one goes straight for your pride. Tonight, you'll wear the fool's mark. That might sound dramatic, like a glowing rune or some cursed amulet, but the reality is even more brutal. It's a sign, a symbol, a visual declaration to the household, and sometimes the village, that you messed up. It could be anything from a wooden token hung around your neck to a patch sewn onto your clothes, or even, yes, this was real, a literal rope tail tied to your belt to suggest you were acting like a beast. And it stays on until the adults say otherwise. In your case, it's a painted wooden medallion about the size of a small loaf. It's got a crude face carved into it, wide eyes, drooping tongue, and a ridiculous mustache. It's meant to be funny, but when it's swinging against your chest as you walk through the kitchen, it feels anything but. You've officially been branded the fool of the house. Historically, this kind of punishment is tied to shame rituals, a long and complicated tradition that threads through medieval life like bad embroidery. Historians still argue whether such practices were meant to prevent bad behavior or simply give the community someone to laugh at. Either way, they were everywhere. In England, children might wear a dunce-style hood, but not necessarily conical. Some were shaped like animal ears, especially donkey ears, the symbol of stubbornness and idiocy. France had the coiffe de honte, a cap of shame, which could be made from paper or cheap linen, often scribbled with drawings or Latin insults. Because nothing stings like public humiliation in dead languages. You shuffle past your uncle. He stares at the medallion, smirks, and goes back to peeling onions. The idea here isn't pain, it's social itchiness, that subtle, inescapable discomfort of being known as the one who goofed, and having that identity physically announced by whatever dangling, jingling, scratchy object they've decided to slap on you. There's a fringe tidbit from Catalonia where a child who lied might be made to wear a mask with a growing nose, crafted from stiffened fabric and worn during meals. It didn't even need to be realistic, just long and wobbly and humiliating. But here's where it gets weird. Some kids leaned into it. Being the fool came with its own kind of twisted status. You became the joke, yes, but also the story, the memory, the loudest giggle at the table, and for some children, that beat being forgotten. That said, the risk was always escalation. If you mocked the punishment too well, you were given a worse one. Some households had layered systems. Wear the medallion once, and you're a fool. Refuse to take it seriously? Add the donkey ears. Still defiant? You're eating dinner outside with the goats. You now sit at supper, trying to hide your chest behind your bowl. But the medallion swings every time you lift your spoon. You chew faster, as though speed will somehow blur your shame. The worst part? Everyone acts normal. They don't point. They don't laugh. They just notice, which, as you're learning, is far worse than scolding. Sometimes these punishments were temporary, a day, a few hours, but some could last a week. And in certain schools, a child would be forced to hand the fool's object to the next misbehaving student, creating a system of inherited shame. It passed like a plague, one smug grin at a time. You remember one poor boy who wore a belt with bells for 3 days. He couldn't sneak anywhere. Every step tattled on him. That's the insidious genius of the fool's mark. It makes your punishment visible and audible. It multiplies its reach. Everyone gets to join in the lesson, even if they're not the one wearing it. You shuffle off to bed later, unbuckling the medallion carefully, like it might bite. You hang it on the peg they told you to, not on the floor, not under the blanket. No, it must be displayed. Part of the lesson is owning your error. And here's the twist. Tomorrow, when someone else is handed the mark, and you're the one watching, you might smirk too, just a little, because that's the quiet, uncomfortable truth of medieval punishments like this one. They don't just teach discipline, they teach ranking. They train children to monitor each other, to compare, to fear being laughed at, and sometimes to laugh back before anyone can beat them to it. You turn onto your side, the faint smell of the painted wood still clinging to your collar. You're not in pain, you're not hungry, you're just marked. And somehow that lingers more than any switch. Morning again, but today feels tense. The fool's mark is off. Your shoulders feel a bit lighter. No one's called your name with that special tone, the one that means you're in trouble, but we're saving the show for after breakfast. Still, you stay quiet, head down, hoping that maybe, finally, the medieval universe will grant you a full day of peace. No such luck, because this time your punishment isn't about your body, your pride, or your feet. It's about your mouth. Welcome to the not-so-gentle world of verbal silence punishments, medieval parenting's favorite tool when your tongue runs too far ahead of your brain. You're not allowed to speak to anyone all day. No matter what happens, no matter if someone spills barley soup on your tunic or accuses you of stealing the good spoon, you must remain absolutely, entirely silent. This isn't the same as being ignored. That was the isolation chair's job. This is the inverse. You're ignored only if you open your mouth. In fact, your success today is judged not by behavior, but by absence, by restraint. For a medieval child, especially one with strong opinions about beetroot stew and bedtime prayers, that's a form of psychological strangulation. Historians still argue whether this punishment was a derivative of monastic vows of silence, or if it stemmed from older pagan traditions where children were taught to respect adult space through non-speech. Some believe it came from agricultural life, where silence during work was prized, and children who couldn't shut up were viewed as disruptions to order. Whatever the source, by the 13th century, enforced silence had become a common family tool. And let's be clear, this wasn't a quiet time punishment. This was total verbal lockdown. In some households, breaking silence meant starting over. One word, one noise. The clock reset. Others used the counting pebble method, 3 stones placed on a windowsill. Each word spoken, 1 was removed. 3 gone, and you were back on the punishment mat. Fringe tidbit: in a few parts of rural Bohemia, children had to carry a small wooden flute tied to their belt during silent punishment. The irony? They weren't allowed to play it. It was a symbol of the words they couldn't use. You try to keep your face neutral now. That's part of it. If you look angry, someone might ask why, and then you're trapped. Do you break the silence to defend yourself, or let the world assume you're guilty, moody, or worse, constipated? It's a strange day. You nod a lot. You point. You raise your eyebrows so often they start to cramp. Your little brother starts asking questions just to annoy you. You stare. He pokes your arm. You keep staring. This might be the most infuriating punishment yet, and you're not alone. In medieval writings, records from tutors and abbots often mention the silent penance as being more effective than corporal punishment, especially for clever children, the kind who could argue, lie, or distract with humor. Strip them of their tongue, and suddenly they're just stuck. Even worse, you're still expected to participate in the day. No hiding in the pantry, no sneaking off to the stable. You're doing chores, reading prayers, cleaning shoes, all in silence. At lunch, you drop your spoon. You want to say, oops, but that's a sound. That's language. That's 1 pebble down. So you shrug and let it clatter. Everyone hears it. No one reacts. You're on a stage with no lines. Here's the secret horror. You start hearing your thoughts louder. The inner voice that usually gets drowned out by complaints, jokes, and questions, it's loud now and repetitive. Why did I say that to Aunt Marta? Why did I kick the stool during grace? Is that fly staring at me? Even your breath feels like it's trying to talk. Some homes had extra rules you couldn't write either. No sneaky chalkboard confessions, total vocal absence. Just labor, breath, and your own echoing mind. In one Benedictine school, boys were instructed to wear a red cord around their wrist during silence days. The moment someone saw that cord, they knew. Don't ask, don't joke, don't invite conversation. That kid is in silence, and it's serious. You begin noticing things you usually talk over. The way the firewood hisses when damp. The way your cousin chews with one tooth more than the other. The way your mother hums just a little louder when she's annoyed. It's like the world is shouting back at you in tiny whispers, and it changes something. Because this punishment, unlike others, doesn't rely on pain or spectacle. It's about removal, the removal of your primary power, your voice, and with it goes control, humor, self-defense. You're left with you, just you. At dinner, someone says something genuinely funny, something about a chicken walking like the village priest, and your whole chest shakes with the effort not to laugh. You slap your palm against your thigh instead, quietly, because laughing counts. That's the rule. Eventually the meal ends, the chores are done, the sun vanishes. You think you made it, until your father says, "Well?" Your eyes widen. He smiles. You may speak. And just like that, it comes rushing back. Words, breath, personality. You want to say 10 things at once, but you just croak out, "Thank you," because you are thankful, not for the punishment, but for the release. Silence, in the medieval sense, wasn't about peace. It was about pressure. And you just survived an entire day under it without exploding. Barely, but still. You'd think silence would be the limit. What else could they possibly take from you that hasn't already been stepped on, burned, repented for, or made into a public art project hung around your neck? Well, here's a new one. They take your name, not forever, just long enough to make a point. Today, you are not Thomas, or Agnes, or Eli with the good slingshot aim. No, today you are nothing, literally. This is the punishment known in scattered medieval records as name denial. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. For a set period, no one is allowed to call you by your given name. You're not spoken to directly. You are referred to in third person, if at all. And you're forbidden to use your own name when introducing yourself or answering questions. You don't exist. At least, not as the version of you who used to slam doors and sass your aunt. This punishment lives in the shadowy area between psychological warfare and spiritual metaphor. Historians still argue whether it originated in religious practices, where monks and nuns took new names to shed sin, or from older tribal customs, where names held power, and to remove one's name was to strip their place in the world. Either way, you've just been unnamed, and it burns. You try to ask your sister for a crust of bread. She looks at you, blinks, then says, "Someone's hungry." Ouch. You help stir the pot. No thanks. You fold the linens. No nod. You exist now as a shadow of yourself, doing everything you're supposed to do, but receiving none of the recognition that makes those acts feel real. And that's the point. The punishment hinges on this medieval belief. Identity is relational. You are who you are because of how people treat you. So what happens when they don't? Silence was about speech. This is about belonging. The denial usually lasted a full day. In severe cases, longer. Some families added flair, giving the child a placeholder name like nobody or sinner or that one. One record from southern Germany describes a boy referred to for 3 days as dust. He reportedly cried when his father finally used his real name again. That's how deep this could go. In monasteries, new initiates sometimes underwent silent novitiate periods during which they were not addressed directly, as a way of humbling them and reminding them that identity had to be earned anew. Punitive versions of this trickled down into lay households. But here's the fringe twist. In some rural English homes, children would wear name tokens around their necks, wooden pieces with their name scratched in, and when punished, the token was taken away and hung by the hearth. Until they earned it back, they were not spoken to directly. That sounds silly until you try to go through a day invisible. You try again. The laundry needs to be brought in. You start hauling it, then pause, hoping someone will notice your extra effort. Instead, your cousin walks by and says to no one, "The wind folds cloth better than some people." You want to yell, or cry, or throw a sock, but you don't, because invisible people can't throw socks. This punishment doesn't work well on quiet children. But if you're loud, talkative, known, this is devastating. You live for recognition, and now it's gone, stolen by your own behavior. And here's where the lesson deepens. Medieval households believed in honor by association. If you acted out, you didn't just damage yourself, you damaged your family name. So stripping you of that name, even temporarily, was a way to say, "You don't represent us, not right now." You eat your supper in silence, not because you're forbidden to speak. Today isn't about that, but because no one's inviting you into conversation. And jumping in on your own would break the weird, sacred tension of the punishment. By the fire, your mother tells a story. Everyone laughs. You laugh too, but no one looks. It's like you're floating 6 inches to the left of the room. Eventually, bedtime, and that's when it happens. Your father says, "Thomas, come rake the ashes before sleep." You freeze. That's your name. Your name. It sounds heavy in the air, like a bell rung after silence. You nod. You move. You rake. But the task barely registers. You're too busy savoring the return of your own self, because that's what this punishment did best. It made you miss being you. Some children came back stronger, quieter, more thoughtful. Some cried, a lot. Some said nothing, but went weeks before misbehaving again. You lie down that night thinking not about what you did wrong, but about the silence between your name being taken and your name being returned. And for the first time, maybe ever, you whisper it aloud to yourself. Just once, just to feel real again. You still feel the echo of your name in your chest. It's strange how something as simple as being called Thomas again can feel like a warm cup pressed into your hands. Basic, taken for granted, until it's gone. But the medieval parent isn't interested in your poetic self-reflection. They're interested in your hands, because today they're punishing you through dexterity denial. In other words, you're not allowed to use your dominant hand. This may sound like an annoying school prank until you realize how everything in your world, from eating to lighting a fire, suddenly becomes an uphill battle. If you're right-handed, today you're left-handed. If you're left-handed, well, congratulations. Now you're considered slightly suspicious and you're being punished. Left-handedness, after all, was often seen as unlucky, unclean, or even devilish in medieval folklore. The adults give you a long piece of twine, which they wrap around your wrist and tie to your belt. Not tightly, not painfully, but enough to restrict movement. It's symbolic, like a leash on a dog that doesn't need walking until it does. This punishment was used especially on children who used their hands for mischief. Thievery, pinching, scribbling, rude drawings, accidentally spilling someone else's porridge. Hands were the tools of disobedience, so restraining them became the correction. And unlike the isolation mat or the silent treatment, this punishment lets you stay in the mix. You're still expected to help with chores, carry buckets, cut vegetables carefully, and thread your own tunic loops, just with the bad hand. Fringe story? In 14th century Poland, certain village schools required boys who wrote with their left hand to write with their right for a full week as punishment for daydreaming. It was believed to train the body to obey even when the mind wandered. So here you are, peeling turnips like a newborn foal, trying to play the violin. The knife keeps slipping. The peel breaks unevenly. Your cousin giggles and mutters, "Should have thought of that before you flicked peas at the priest." You're not allowed to respond. Not because you're silenced today, just because you're too focused on not slicing your thumb. Historians still argue whether this kind of handedness punishment had roots in Roman discipline or ecclesiastical ideas about humility. There are references in early Christian texts to using the weak hand to strengthen the will, which sounds poetic until you're trying to tie your own shoes with it. In some households, this punishment had a little ceremony, a quiet scolding, followed by a binding of the wrist with a prayer like, "Let the hand remember peace." Some took it further and painted the fingernails of the dominant hand black with soot or ink to mark it as idle. If you used the wrong hand, punishment doubled. Double chore duty, extra prayers, or worse, the dreaded bread crust penalty, where your dinner is replaced by stale, dry crusts, which are, incidentally, very hard to break using just one hand. Even simple things turn humiliating. Picking up a bowl, brushing ash off your sleeve, waving. You start overcompensating, gesturing with your whole arm like you're trying to guide a ship into harbor. That's the other part of the lesson, awareness. This punishment doesn't just inconvenience you, it forces you to pay attention to everything. How you move, what you touch, whether your hand really needs to be involved at all. Every moment becomes deliberate, and that's the point. Not pain, not shame, just persistent inconvenience. A tap on the shoulder that never stops tapping. There's a passage in a 13th century parenting manuscript that reads, The hands must know their master is the mind and not the mood. It's pompous, but weirdly accurate. You wash dishes after supper. Each one takes twice as long. You write a line of prayers, slowly, crookedly, with ink splatters that look like abstract ducks. Your mother checks the results, then nods, not approvingly, just acknowledging that you did it. That's more than enough. You untie the twine just before bed. The wrist itches. Your dominant hand feels strangely heavy now, like it's forgotten how to exist unshamed. You flex it a little, watching the fingers move like strangers reintroducing themselves. Did it work? Did the punishment make you reflect on mischief, or just resent your clumsy elbow? Maybe both. That's the medieval specialty, layered correction, physical annoyance paired with emotional awareness. They didn't need you to bleed. They needed you to notice yourself. And tonight, you do. As you fall asleep, you promise not to flick peas again, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't worth tying your hand to your belt for. The next morning, the twine is gone. Your right hand is free again, slightly sore, but obedient. You crack your knuckles a little and silently vow to keep it out of trouble, or at least save its antics for a day when the grown-ups are too tired to notice. But your fingers aren't the only part of you that gets into mischief. Today's punishment is all about your eyes. More specifically, visual restriction. Imagine this. You wake up, stretch, and a cloth is tied gently but firmly around your head, covering your eyes. No, not a blindfold you might peek through or wiggle off when no one's looking. A real covering, possibly layered linen or a stitched sack hood that darkens your whole world. Congratulations. Today you are in the dark. This punishment was meant to teach caution, humility, and dependence. And for the child who always needed to see everything, who stared too hard, peeked where they shouldn't, or rolled their eyes once too often, this was poetic justice. You fumble your way to the basin. Someone coughs to your left. You flinch. You knock over a wooden cup, and it hits the floor with that echoing thunk that feels extra loud when you're already embarrassed. Historians still argue whether this method was borrowed from early monastic training exercises, where novices were sometimes blindfolded to represent their ignorance before God. Others claim it came from older folk traditions, where the removal of vision was a symbolic reset, a temporary break from the world to realign behavior. In some households, the blindfolded child would wear a bell on their belt, not to shame them, but to let others know they were coming. Safety measure or extra embarrassment? Hard to say. Depends on the size of the bell. And here's the irony. You're still expected to do your chores. Today, you're shelling peas. Yes, blind. The bowl feels bottomless. The peas fly everywhere. Your hands move like they're underwater. Your cousin whispers, "One rolled under the dog," and you hear your punishment deepen by another few hours. Visual restriction punishments were especially common in homes with multiple children. The idea was partly practical. It stopped a misbehaving child from copying others or making faces. But more than that, it was about control through disorientation. Take away vision, and the world becomes guesswork. You can't predict, can't lead. You become a quiet part of the scenery. Some parents upped the ante by adding guides. Another child would be assigned to lead the blindfolded one, creating a temporary reversal of roles. The naughty older sibling, humbled and led by the obedient younger one. That's a power shift medieval parents loved. Your little sister holds your hand now, smug as a swan in velvet. She leads you from the table to the hearth, where you're told to sit still, like a well-trained stone. Fringe tidbit. In 12th century Italy, certain boarding schools employed a similar tactic called le ombre, or the shadows, where disobedient students were made to wear tinted veils over their heads for a full day, muting both sight and sound. So they may look inward, one headmaster wrote. It wasn't just discipline, it was a medieval form of forced introspection, and it's oddly effective. Without your eyes, your ears take over. You hear the creak of the door, the spoon against the pot. Someone sniffles. Someone else scratches their scalp. You become hyper-present, completely tethered to the moment, because the future, the next step, the next sound, the next surprise is totally hidden. For some, this triggers reflection. For others, mild panic. You swing between both. You try to remember what you did to deserve this. Was it sneaking an extra handful of berries? Reading your brother's private list of favorite saints out loud in a funny voice? Or was it the thing with the donkey? Maybe best not to mention the donkey. By midday, you're allowed to remove the blindfold. You sit blinking in the light, like a new hatchling. Nothing's changed around you. The fire still flickers. Your sister still smirks, but you feel different, exposed, alert, slightly dizzy. And there's one more twist. Some children, after enough time in the dark, don't want to take it off, not because they enjoy blindness, but because the quiet it created becomes strangely comforting. Without the responsibility of looking, of watching, of reacting, you're left with stillness. And once that stillness settles, breaking it can feel loud, like smashing glass. So you sit there, even with the blindfold in your lap, staring at the floor, and you think, really think, about how often your eyes get you into trouble, and how much of the world still exists when you don't get to see it, not as a punishment, but as a lesson. Your eyes are open again, not just literally, though the sun stings after the long stretch of darkness, but figuratively, too. You're starting to see the rhythm here, the strange logic behind the punishments, how they aim not to destroy you, but to reshape you, not just from the outside in, but from the inside out. Unfortunately, your feet haven't gotten the memo. Today's punishment? Foot labor, not barefoot discipline, not icy water walks, not anything you've already endured. No, today is about walking without purpose, a full-body version of the burden chores from earlier, but now with distance. Welcome to the medieval useless errand. The punishment is simple in design, exhausting in execution. You are sent from point A to point B with an object, a note, a stone, a bucket of nothing. And when you arrive, you are told, "Now take it back." That's it. You're a one-child relay race with no team and no finish line. In this particular moment, you've been handed a sealed pouch filled with dried lentils, an object so absurdly mundane it feels like a joke. Your aunt says, "Take this to the far field." You ask what to do once you're there. She just says, "Return it." Classic. Historians still argue whether these punishment walks were borrowed from monastic messenger systems, where young monks carried scrolls or jugs over long distances to build discipline, or whether it stemmed from feudal labor traditions, where serfs were often made to walk needlessly to prove loyalty. But the child version? It's pure theater. You trudge across the path, past the vegetable patch, past the crooked fence, past Old Man Herwig's goat that always gives you that look. The pouch swings at your side. Not heavy, but not light enough to forget it's there. Some families made these walks formal, adding ritual. You had to bow before leaving, say a prayer halfway, sing a verse to prove you weren't slacking. In a few noble households, you had to wear a ribbon during the walk, a symbol of your temporary penance. Pink meant you were foolish. Brown meant you'd lied. Black meant don't ask. You reach the far field. No one's there. You wait. Nothing happens. You turn around. The goat is still watching. Back you go. Your feet are hot. Your knees ache. You are now more grain mule than child. This punishment stings especially hard because it mimics importance. You're carrying something. You're moving. You're clearly on a mission. And yet the mission is empty. There's no glory, no impact, no applause. Just you, the road, and the absurdity of lentils. Fringe story time. In 15th century Wales, children caught skipping prayer sessions were assigned a punishment called pilgrim duty. They were given an acorn, symbol of humility, and told to walk it from one church door to another, sometimes over 3 miles apart, and back again. It had no religious function, just metaphor baked into blisters. Back at the house, your aunt takes the pouch without even glancing inside. "Good," she says. "Now take this stick to the tree stump and lean it there." You squint at her, wondering if she's making it up as she goes. She probably is. That's another layer to these punishments, obedience despite absurdity. In medieval parenting, the goal wasn't always moral clarity. Sometimes it was just shaping the will. If you can follow orders that don't make sense, you'll definitely follow the ones that do. You head back out, stick in hand, wind in your ears, phantom itch in your calves, and you start to think, what's the difference between this and regular work? The answer lies in purpose. When your chores feed the family, there's dignity. When your errands save no one and change nothing, they become discipline. Discipline wears the costume of utility, but underneath it's just character calisthenics. You reach the tree stump, place the stick, turn. A crow caws behind you like it's laughing. On your return trip, you're asked to fetch a cup from the stable, then a stone from the stream, then, inexplicably, another stick, because the last one was too round. You want to scream. Instead, you sigh. That's the victory they're looking for. Because these walks, these loops, they teach you how to live with futility, how to breathe through boredom, how to sweat through irritation, and that, in the medieval mind, is what separates child from disciplined person. By dusk, your legs feel like stuffed sausages, your arms tingle. You've walked nearly the entire property twice, and you never once held a task that meant anything. But here's the twist. You didn't rebel. You didn't run. You didn't drop the lentils and declare mutiny. You just walked and returned. The day ends without ceremony. You're handed a hunk of bread, not warm, not buttered, but also not crust only. That, too, is a kind of reward. And as you sit down, rubbing your knees, you wonder if you've been broken or just molded, because something in you is quieter now, less explosive, more tired, maybe, but also more aware of how far you can walk before you really start to complain. Your legs ache. Your eyes feel permanently narrowed by sun and dust, and your brain, though tired, can now anticipate absurd tasks before they're even spoken aloud. You've delivered lentils, apologized to chickens, sat in silent misery, and peeled turnips like a left-handed ghost. If there's a prize for surviving medieval parenting, you might just deserve it. But there's one punishment left, one final, infamous favorite among the child-raising elite of the Middle Ages. Today, you're going to wear your sin, not carry it, not act it out, not atone for it with chores or silence. You're going to become it. Welcome to costume humiliation, a theatrical, symbolic, and wildly effective medieval punishment where children were dressed up in outfits that represented their misbehavior. The idea? Public correction through visible absurdity. Let's say you lied. You're not just scolded. You're dressed as a giant tongue, usually made of sackcloth, sometimes with painted red streaks to resemble a mouth out of control. If you stole food, you might be dressed as a pig, complete with snout. If you showed off, you'd wear a mock crown and a robe stitched from rags, labeled the little king who forgot his place. Yes, labeled, literal signs pinned to your chest, the medieval version of I made bad choices t-shirts, but with more hay. Today, your sin was vanity. Yesterday, you admired yourself in the copper basin a little too long and called yourself a vision. Your aunt did not agree with your assessment, so this morning you're wearing a garland of turnip leaves on your head and a belt made of stringed onion bulbs around your waist. You are, apparently, the Prince of Rot. Children laugh. Even the serious adults smirk. It's humiliating, and that's the point. Historians still argue whether this kind of performance-based discipline was drawn from local festival traditions, like the Feast of Fools, where roles were reversed and mockery reigned, or whether it had deeper Roman roots in Saturnalia, where servants dressed as masters in controlled chaos. In homes, it became punishment theater, shame wrapped in play. Fringe anecdote. One noble tutor in 13th century Burgundy had a wardrobe of punishment costumes, each hand-sewn with care. A fish suit for gossip, a turtle shell for laziness, a dog tail for greed. Children dreaded them, and yet sometimes asked to try them on just to see. Because that's the strange, slippery line this punishment dances on. It's humiliating, yes, but it's also fascinating. As a child, the moment you're costumed, you're transformed into a joke, a warning, a story, and part of you feels it. You shuffle to the bread table, your turnip crown drooping. Someone bows mockingly. Another gives you a coin for your royal smell. Your punishment will last all day, not in isolation, not in silence, but out in the world, because that's the cruel genius. You still do everything, chores, prayers, meals, but now as a character, as your misbehavior made visible. The goal is not just correction, it's internalization. You're not just punished. You're made to reflect every time someone looks at you. Some families were even more theatrical. They'd gather the children and ask the sinner to perform a short skit, reenacting their mistake in front of the others. A child who lied would play both the liar and the consequence. I am the tongue that spoke falsely, and now I taste the vinegar of regret. It sounds dramatic. It was, but it also worked, especially in households that prized storytelling. By late afternoon, your garland smells like compost. The onions are slipping. You've had to tie them back up twice, and yet you're no longer sulking. You're moving with a strange kind of dignity, because eventually even this kind of humiliation becomes something else, perspective. You see yourself from the outside. You recognize the ridiculousness of your sin, and that recognition changes you faster than a cane ever could. When evening comes, your aunt removes the garland. She doesn't say anything. She just nods, and somehow that's enough. You're clean again. Not in scent. Your belt still reeks, but in identity. You're no longer the Prince of Rot. You're just Thomas. And as you slip into bed, you don't feel angry. You feel still. You've made it. You've survived every kind of punishment the Middle Ages could throw at you. Physical, emotional, symbolic. You've sat, walked, hauled, wept, laughed, itched, sweated, and blushed your way through 20 days of discipline. And now, finally, it's over. The fire's low now, just a soft, glowing puddle of orange near the hearth, crackling gently in the quiet room. The punishment costumes are folded away, the silence rules lifted, the silly medallion hangs on its nail, unmoving. You're lying under a heavy wool blanket that smells faintly of soap and straw, your hands tucked beneath your cheek, your name fully returned to you, and slowly the noise of the day, the chores, the smirks, the footfalls, drifts away. In this stillness, you realize something curious. Each punishment wasn't just about pain or shame or performance. It was about training your rhythm, teaching you, bit by bit, how to pause before acting, how to notice your surroundings, how to see yourself from the outside, not always fairly, not always kindly, but with honesty. You can still feel the weight of the onion belt, but it doesn't sting anymore, because you learned something from every mat, every mile walked, every lentil delivered to nowhere. You learned endurance, restraint, a tiny bitter taste of humility. And now, in this gentle dark, your mind is quiet. You've been through the worst of it, and still, here you are, intact, and just a little bit wiser. So let your breath slow, let your eyelids droop, and let this ancient world of strange punishments fade away, like smoke rising from the last ember. Sleep well. You've earned it.